back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing the wrap-up of all the books I read in May. I read 15 books. I don't have notes. Ongoing struggle with me. This past month I just got way more busy, mostly because I hit my second week post-vaccination, so I'm now fully vaccinated. So I've been more comfortable going to places with more frequency, because usually I tried to space out what I was doing, but I've put more stuff back to back. And then also my partner and I have been upping our wedding planning stuff. We chose our venue. We're waiting to sign the contract. And then I went shopping for a wedding dress and found a dress. So now I need to work on, and then I finally have some back to work dates for my job. Yay! I'll be going in for a week of maintenance in June. And then our season will be kind of starting up end of August, beginning of September. Alright, books. Let's see how much I can sweat through this, because it's warm, but we haven't installed the fans in our window yet. Okay, 15 books. Let's go. The first... Nope, that's not the right book. First book I finished was Jardín Secreto, which is The Secret Garden, by Frances Hodgson Burnett, translated into Spanish by Lauro, Palma. So I have a yearly goal of trying to read 4 books in Spanish this year. My reading level is like middle grade YA. This is a book that I had. Secret Garden is one of my favorite childhood books and probably one of the only classics that I love. So yeah, so I was already very familiar with the story, which helped. So this was just a nice, return to this story. Okay, I'm going to talk about some of these books out of order because they need to get paired together. So I'm going to talk about this in conjunction with this book. This is Disfigured, on Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space by Amanda Leduc. This is nonfiction. I mostly listened to the audiobook, and it's narrated by Amanda Barker. So we'll jump back to Secret Garden in a minute. So this is a book that analyzes the presence of disability, mostly in the form of fairy tales. It goes into some modern Disney stories and a couple of other notable fictional characters, like Quasimodo from Hunchback of Notre Dame is one of them, but it mostly focuses on fairy tales and fairy tales from Europe. So mostly Grimm's Fairy Tales and Hans Christian Andersen. So sometimes it's quite academic in terms of tracing the historical source of the fairy tales and how they reflected the overall culture at the time. But where it gets really interesting is talking about the themes that the presence of disability plays. A lot of disability as punishment for someone being bad, the themes of religion, somebody just having enough faith and trust in God and then they magically get healed. It's an interesting look at how disability and different abilities, different body differences, neurological differences have been treated in fiction. And in particular, what's interesting is the narrative of the only disability is a bad attitude. Again, kind of with the religious theme of if you have enough faith and if you're just a good enough person, eventually you will be healed and you will be rewarded. And it's interesting to see that theme in Secret Garden because if you're not familiar with the story, there is a character named Colin. He is the son of the lord or the important rich guy who owns the house. He's the son, and he is an invalid. He believes himself to be an invalid. It is unclear if he's actually sick or disabled, or if he just thought he was because he was treated as such his whole life. And over the course of his friendship with Mary, he becomes a much happier person and eventually regains a lot of strength, regains appetite, and learns to walk. And so reading this, in conjunction with reading this, I was like, oh, how would the story have been different if Colin was actually disabled or actually chronically ill and did not learn to walk at the end of the story, or did not, become a magically healthy boy at the end of the story. I don't want to read too much into it because it's not really about, like, whether or not Colin is actually sick. It's more about, like, the healing power of the garden and the rejuvenating power of springtime. This is a perfect springtime book, by the way. I was reading this, like, as everything was starting to bloom and get sunny and warm around here, so I loved it for that. But yeah, it was just interesting to be like, oh, that's a aspect of the story that I'd never really thought about. So, interesting. Sort of next, because, okay, now I'm already going out of order. Sort of next, I finished, not the Poppy War. I finished The Dragon Republic, the second book in the Poppy War series. So this one, I was hoping we would get to learn more about the magic and the deities in this world, but Rin spends a lot of the book with her power locked away from either from PTSD, or like she gets poisoned, or like a spell put on her, so she isn't able to rely on her magic for a lot of the book, which was kind of disappointing. This book is more about, the title comes from Rin and her fellow soldiers are now following a military general who is kind of amassing this army to form the new rulers of the region, hence the name the Dragon Republic. They are from the Dragon Province. So it's kind of seeing the aftermath of active war, who is as the dust is settling, who's going to come out on top. So we're seeing less horror of active battle and more the horrors of the starvation that comes afterwards, and completely burned out cities and the masses of refugees. There's a lot of themes in there. There's a line in there that's kind of like Rin looking, I think it's from Rin. She's looking at these high up generals talking about all these things, but then she's literally looking at the people who are starving, and the line is foundation, growing pains, future generations. Such abstract concepts, she thought. Concepts that wouldn't compute for the average peasant. Who cared who sat on the throne at Singard when vast stretches of the empire were underwater? So anyway, that's a theme of the book, is like, these people are like, this is for the good of the whole country. And she's like, the country are people who... You don't know what this country actually is. This country is the peasants. It's the people, who farm your food and make your fabric and forge your tools, and you don't actually give a shit about them. There's a lot in there about PTSD and kind of the way it manifests in Rin, with her always wanting to have a figure who kind of absolves her of responsibility and tells her what to do, but also makes her feel valued and special. So that was an interesting plot line. The plot line with Neza was quite interesting. I don't want to get into it because it's a spoiler, but yeah, I liked that, and I wanted more of that, which, we're talking about the exploration of the magic system and getting to see other manifestations of it beyond what Rin was able to learn from, what was the name of the guy who turned out to be the gatekeeper. Yeah, I wanted more magic. I learned this, I think I figured this out when I was reading The Well of Ascension the month before, where it's in a fantasy that's, I don't love as much fantasy books that are very focused solely on magic in combat, or a world at war and dealing with a lot of military stuff. I can tell that it is well done. Again, I do think that this is a very engaging and well-written and well-researched book, but it's just okay, I have now learned that military fantasy is not a buzzword to catch my interest. Which I have to emphasize, I do really like this series, and I'm excited. The third one should be coming available soon at my library, so I'm excited to finish out the series. I'm excited to read more stuff by R.F. Kuang. Enough of that. What next? Okay, then I read Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo. This is a sequel to Six of Crows. This one, again, was a lot of fun. It still definitely has, like, the heist element of Six of Crows, but instead of, like, planning for one long heist, it's more like they plan one heist and then things go wrong, so then they have to improvise and regroup, and then they kind of have to, like, hurriedly plan, like, another heist, and then that goes wrong, so then they have to regroup. But yeah, I still enjoyed it. I liked Nina's storyline of learning a different facet of the magic system in this world. Interestingly, in contrast to the Poppy War, while I'm not a huge fan of, like, military fantasy, I am a fan of, like, political intrigue fantasy. It's a fine line there. But yeah, I love the characters in this book, and I love seeing the scrappy ways that Kaz lives to fight another day. Nothing too in depth to say, but, like, I'm enjoying the series. Of course, like, with the what's the show that just came on? You know what it is. Grishaverse. Of course, like, the waiting list for all of these other books are now, like, 6 months long. So I'm slowly making my way through the series. As the books become available, I'm not in a rush. There's so much to read. Okay. Okay, so next I'm gonna briefly summarize how many books? This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 books that I read. They were on my TBR for the Asian Readathon, but my last video was a vlog where I talk about these books in more depth. The vlog's kind of chaotic, and I don't have, like, a good... My vlogs are always chaotic, but I do go into these books more in depth. But to shortly summarize, I read I Hope We Choose Love, A Trans Girl's Notes from the End of the World by Cheng Thom. This is a nonfiction kind of memoir, essays with some poetry. This one was excellent. I very much want to read this again, and then read more works by this author. The author is Chinese, Canadian, and trans. Then I read The Bride Test by Helen Hoang. This was fun. Again, like, I go into more detail in the vlog. Then I reread a book I did not remember much about, Haroun in the Sea of Stories by Salman Rushdie. This was very, very charming. This is one of Rushdie's middle grade novels. He mostly writes, like, adult literary fiction. But this was a lot of fun. Then I read a book that I have already gotten rid of. This was a nonfiction. This was People Power, an Eyewitness History of the Philippine Revolution of 1986. It was interesting. I do feel like I learned a lot, but I feel like in terms of learning about this point in history, I feel like this is not going to be the best thing out there. The format was kind of weird. I wouldn't have picked it up on my own if it wasn't something that I already had. And then the last one I talk about in the vlog was Dragon Pearl by Yoon Lee. This was so much fun. I think supposedly we're getting a follow-up novel to this in the near future, even though I think it was originally written as a standalone. So anyway, I'm looking forward to that, and I'm looking forward to checking out more works by Yoon Lee. Yay. Okay. Great, that's 5 books done in this giant list. Okay, what next? Ooh, okay. Next I read A Lesson in Thorns by Sierra Simone. Oh, where did I hear about this book first? I wish I could remember. It might have been The Bookish Realm. Maybe. I don't know. Anyway, so this is a dark academia, dark romance. This was delicious. Very steamy. There's a very excellent spanking scene in there. But it's very dark. There's a lot of, like, pagan fertility sex rituals and like old dusty libraries. There's people of very fluid sexualities. Like everyone is like bisexual, pansexual to some point. We kind of revolve around this love triangle between Poe, I think her name is Proserpina, and then, I don't remember, bad with names, but the rich boy who owns the house, and then, like, the poor boy whose mother, like, worked at the house, the poor boy who lived in the village, but they all kind of grew up, like, having crushes on each other. They're all full adults now. And something happened between the two boys that we don't really learn about in full until the third book. So there's a lot of, like, love triangle angst. There's a lot of jealousy. But the you really see this in the second book, which I also read this month. So I should also talk about Feast of Sparks, which is the second book. I like what the author is doing with the jealousy, because usually you see jealousy and it just makes the jealous person act like a shithead, like being super accusatory and untrustworthy. But in this book, all it does is just make them like more horny and possessive, which for this book, this mood, it works. It works. And like at the end of the first book, we have like quite a horrific revelation. Again, it's I wish I should have written down trigger warnings, but again, I have no notes. But it's like death of a parent, discovery of what happened to them, death of a parent on multiple sides, recovery from sexual trauma. The first book deals a lot with like a bunch of characters being virgins, which like the virgin trope, I can take it or leave it. Mostly I can leave it. But it didn't get in the way of me enjoying the story. I also really like this author's writing. She has these descriptions that are like very poetic, and it's just the atmosphere in these books is, you know, if you're into dark academia, if you're into dark, broody, angsty, dark romances. So I guess like an example of some of her word choices. As I pull words from him like teeth, I think of the boy I married in the Thorn Chapel, the boy who crackled with mischief and life. How did he turn into this man of frost and doubt, and why? So there's also like a lot of descriptions about the land and the ritual. There's like, it's almost paranormal, but not quite. But there's this indication of like these rituals that the people in this group are kind of all wrapped up in and like compelled to do, and they're like compelled to repeat history. And with like the pagan rituals of like Samhain and what are they, Imbolc, and like these other rituals of like death and rebirth and fertility and whatever. So I liked it. It's not going to be for everybody. There's 4 books in the series. I've read 2 of them. Hurrah. Then I picked up, I think the first historical romance I've ever read. This is The Duke I Tempted by Scarlett Peckham. This one was definitely recommended by, what's her name? Hold on. Okay. So this was I picked this up on the recommendation of the Book Refuge. It was something like favorite historical romances in order of steaminess. I can't find the exact title, but if I can find a link to it, I will put that in the description box. She mostly does like romance book stuff. And she does a lot of like recommending specific tropes. She recently did one that was recommendations of heroes or heroines with hardware down there. If that's something you want book recommendations for. So this is a historical romance following a duke And there's a woman who very much wants to be a not botanist. She wants to like own a greenhouse. She's like working on importing magnolia flowers from the New World. This is in England. So like she's importing flowers. She wants to own a nursery. That's the word. Nursery for people to like buy plants, and she wants to like breed strains that are more suitable to the English gloomy weather, etc. So she is somebody, she wants to be a business owner. She wants to be very independent, but she's a woman. There's problems with her family and her finances. So, long story, romance. So, romance story magic. She and this Duke enter into a romantic arrangement because they can supposedly give each other what they need, and it doesn't necessarily need to be romantic. But of course, they start to fall for each other. There's some BDSM elements in this of the Duke is into some of these things, and this is something that the female heroine doesn't know anything about, but like when she starts discovering it, she's like, wait, I'm into this. Hold on. What's wrong with me? Is this okay? And it's a romance, so like it ends happily ever after. So it's kind of on the darker side where like there's definitely some, you know that they're going to end up happily ever after. I think the author even has like a little disclaimer in the beginning, just being like, don't worry, they're going to be fine. It's going to be a little bumpy along the way. So anyway, but yeah, I enjoyed that. I would read more in that series. I mean, I don't think historical romance really pulls me too much, but it's not a reason to not read something. Alright, so next I finished A Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. This is a book I picked up from a free library. This is going to fill one of my... I'm trying to read more translated books. This is translated from French, but nowhere in this edition does it say who the translator was. This is like an older edition. So this was fine. I feel like things I liked was for a classic and for a translated classic, I felt it was very readable. The language was like very easy to understand. The action moved quite quickly. It was very action driven. These characters are all some of them are larger than life, but they're all quite unique. And there's also like not an overabundance of characters, so you don't, because it really focuses on 3 characters for most of the book, which is our narrator, his uncle, who's like an eccentric, not absent-minded professor, but like crazy, passionate, creative professor, and then a Icelandic strongman who comes with them on their journeys and pretty much like never talks. I was really disappointed in his character because he was basically a really strong robot. He's supposed to be painted as like, an adventurer and very strong and, nothing frazzles him, but like, he has no personality. He's literally just there to carry their stuff and be the muscle and be the person who like knows how to make a boat out of driftwood. I hated our narrator. He was annoying as fuck. He complained like the whole time, but that when things were not going good, he complained the whole time, which, okay, yes, you're running out of water and you're, almost dying of thirst or you're dying of hunger or something, but also like, where the fuck is your sense of adventure? Like, if you are not an adventurer, why are you on this fucking exploratory journey into these caverns, into the center of the earth? Like, honey, why did you say yes to this? But then when things are going great, he's like, this is like fantastic. Here we are, like forging a new path. We will be remembered. It's just like he's such a fair and foul weather character that I was just quite annoyed by him. The uncle, as much as like he's painted as like this larger than life character, I actually like don't really think much about him. I think he's mostly just like a vehicle to learn about the knowledge of like geology of the time period. It would very much put me in mind of Moby Dick, where yes, there are these themes, these certain overarching themes, but along the way you're going to get like a textbook history lesson about something. So this is like a history lesson of what the knowledge of geology and like volcanic activity was at the time this book was written, and then also what theories were kind of at play at the time, and what scientific equipment would have been available to learn about these things at the time. Some, you know, kind of like with Moby Dick, you learn a lot about how did whaling actually work. That was my favorite part of Moby Dick. That was not my favorite part of this book. You got this quite dry geology lesson, and I didn't love it. Like, it was, again, like, it was interesting to kind of think about, like, what information did they have at the time, but I don't think it was done in a way that was integrated well with the story. Anyway, like, overall, like, I don't regret reading it. I'd probably read more Jules Verne in the future, but it'll probably be, again, like, a library read, or if I find it in a free library. But I do appreciate that, like, the language of it is quite accessible. It's quite action-packed. It's not very long. Yeah. Okay. We're almost done. We got 2 more books left. Okay. So next I finished The Kitchen God's Wife by Amy Tan. I'm going to put up a picture of what the cover is supposed to look like. I didn't realize how faded this cover was. It must have been left in the sun. I picked this up for free. Not in the free library, from somewhere else. But yeah, that's wild how different the covers look. So this was another, like, thing on my TBR for the Asian Readathon. Also mostly because this was a book on my TBR that I wanted to get through. I've never read anything by Amy Tan, so I was like, let's see what I think. And my thoughts are kind of like what I was expecting, where it's like, overall, I like Amy Tan's writing. I like her ability to craft a story. I like the themes and the way that it's kind of explored in the story. But, oh man, historical fiction's not my jam. I think I was only, like, as engaged as I was because I like how the author told the story. But the story itself, let's see, it follows, what's her name? Winnie. Her name is actually something else in Chinese, but now she goes by Winnie. It starts off with her daughter's perspective, but then we learn the life story of Winnie, of being a young bride in China, and her husband being a general or some military person in China during World War II. And, like, her life as that country was going through upheavals during the war, and then also how abusive that husband was, and her eventual escape from that marriage, and the fact that, like, the means of it have kind of been a secret, and the secret of it has been kept by her friend Helen, who both Winnie and Helen then emigrated to the United States together. I had a hard time understanding what was going on in that character's perspective in context of larger stuff, which I like, that, you know, we get a glimpse of this country during World War II without making a big deal of the World War II that we're mostly taught about. We're not really taught, we're taught a little bit about the Americans, because that's eventually, you know, Winnie eventually marries an American to get out. But we don't really learn, they don't talk about, like, Germany. They don't talk about, you know, Germany and England and, you know, the war in Europe, because it's not about that. And there was a lot going on in the world beyond what was happening in Europe, which, like, I appreciate it, but because of my limited knowledge, I just had a really hard time understanding what was going on here as it related to this world war. And then the like, personal story was, like, I knew that eventually, like, I was engaged in trying to figure out how is she going to get away from this very abusive man. He's both physically abusive and does a lot of gaslighting. There's also, like, trigger warnings for death of a child, rape, and sexual harassment, and I don't know, general horrors of war. The plot line about, like, Winnie and Helen's relationship, it was interesting because it talks a lot about, like, the fallibility of memory and how, like, our narrator will remember events one way, but then, like, Helen will remember them like, no, you didn't give me that. I bought that at this market. There is a tension between these two characters. Like, they're forced to be friends by circumstance, but, like, personality-wise, they're not really friends. But I wish we had gotten some of, like, Helen's perspective for a lot of this stuff, because you just hear a lot of a one-sided perspective of, like, this woman was, like, selfish or unaware or dismissive or all of these, like, unpleasant, annoying things, but we rarely ever get to see, you know, okay, but you're saying, like, she has a terrible memory. Well, what proof do we have that you are the one who's remembering things correctly? Like, I know, like, the point is, like, to kind of struggle with, like, what's the truth here, but it's not really, like, a plot line or a story trope that I enjoyed too much in here. So, I probably read, like, the last quarter of it on audiobook, and I liked the audiobook narration, okay? That was narrated by Gwendoline Yeo. I would read more Amy Tam in the future if I feel motivated to pick up a historical fiction. But yeah, historical fiction, not. It's like, I feel like I just should have read a nonfiction or a memoir. And the last book I finished was where I mostly listened to the audiobook. Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America by Ibram X. Kendi. Let's see, and it was narrated by Christopher Dontrell Piper. I did really enjoy the narration of this. So this is a very thorough nonfiction kind of history, not like textbook, but just like dense history chronicling the history of racist ideas, the history of the concept of racism, the concept of racial hierarchy, and the various people and laws and social structures at play in creating and reinforcing racial hierarchy, particularly in America. If you've read Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, you will see that a lot of moments are framed in the same way that the chapters in that book are framed, in terms of talking about, like, here we're talking about biological racism, now we're talking about gendered racism, now we're talking about like behavioral racism, and like all of these like categories of, you know, how do you establish a racial hierarchy. It's like, yes, okay, we have evidence that, like, genetically we are like 99.9% identical, so okay, now how do we bend our logic into knots backwards to still reinforce that certain people are lesser or more than others. One section that really stuck with me, just like the vague concepts, because I mean, where did I talk about this? But I mentioned that I'm not someone who's going to read one book like this and study it very thoroughly and really commit it to memory. I'm going to listen to an audiobook and retain 10% of what's in here, but I'm going to like read 12 books that basically kind of talk about the same thing. Like, that's more, the repetition is more useful to my memory than like trying to really focus on it, because just trying to focus on it is super overwhelming. But anyway, one concept that kind of stuck with me was the role of religion in Christianity and Christian logic and Christian precedent in the reinforcing of racist ideas. Just like the early tension of, well, it's okay if we enslave black people because they're not Christians. Okay, but then what if one of them converts to Christianity, are they still allowed to be slaves if they're a Christian? Okay, well, let's pull this logic out of our ass. Like, didn't they need their masters to guide them to be good Christians? They, of course, make natural slaves. And, you know, just like spinning the, like, every time one piece of logic gets challenged, they just kind of figure out how do you spin it so that morally you can still be okay with it. So, like, that was interesting. And then also with that, because it was interesting to, like, read about the Quakers and the Mennonites becoming early abolitionists and being quite morally opposed to slavery and racial hierarchy, and how they came to those ideas when, you know, an anti-racist and anti-slavery movement wasn't really a thing yet. So that's like a little piece of that history that I would like to learn more about. Like, what was it about the Mennonites and the Quakers? Like, what was it about their faith? What was happening in that denomination at the time that caused the split of which groups tolerated slavery and racial hierarchy and which ones didn't, to the point of being involved, like, in the Underground Railroad and stuff. So that was just a very, very small snippet that kind of caught my attention. But yeah, it covers all the way up to the civil rights, and let's see, when was this published? Because it talks about Trayvon Martin. This was published in 2016. So I think compared to some of the earlier time periods, it doesn't go into, like, recent stuff as in depth, but that makes sense because there's a lot more resources to read about like, kind of recent anti-racist writings. So anyway, so I definitely think that this is, if you kind of just want an overview of everything about the history of racist ideas in America, this is a good overview. If you kind of want a more, like, less history, names, dates, places focused and more concepts focused, I think Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist is definitely more concepts focused. And then hopefully this year I have an ebook copy of 400 Souls, which is another like, anthology of the history of Black people in America. That's another one that's on my radar that I want to read that one and kind of see how that format compares to this one, just in terms of, like, what it covers, how thoroughly it covers, and, like, if you were gonna read just one that is, like, a composite history, like, I don't know if I'm, like, the best judge. I mean, no, I'm definitely not. I'm definitely not the best judge of, like, what's the best, but, like, I'll give my 2 cents of, like, if you prefer these things, maybe this one. And if you prefer those things, maybe that one. Anyway, that's the wrap-up. I hope that wasn't too chaotic. Time for my outro. I hope you have a good rest of your day. I encourage you to go out into the world and be curious. I will have my other social media places and, like, any videos or whatever I mentioned earlier all linked in the description box below if you want to connect with me elsewhere. I'll catch you on my next video. Bye!